For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. Before the Dark Times. Before the Empire.
The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth. It is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based.
So, I love Star Wars, and I love Star Trek, and lately, I don't know why, they've been on my mind. There's been a lot of talk about these two franchises, and for good reason, as there's a lot to say.
Please, Spock, do me a favor, and don't say it's fascinating.
No. But it is interesting.
But frankly, I'm a little tired of all the usual conversations. So if you want to hear about how George Lucas ripped off of Akira Kurosawa's
Hidden Fort.
or hear about Gene Roddenberry's political agenda, you should probably look elsewhere. No, today I want to talk about something quite specific, divorced from any sort of awareness of film history or contemporary political contexts.
What?
Which is a bit different from what I usually do here for pop culture media. See, when it comes to these two franchises, what really fascinates me is how differently each handles conflict resolution. And more importantly, why? In other words,
These words, and the words that follow, were not written only for the Yangs, but for the Coms as well.
The Coms?
They must apply to everyone, or they mean nothing. Do you understand?
I do not fully understand. One named Kirk. But the holy words will be obeyed. I swear it.
and this. My name is Rafa, and I think most of us can agree that The Empire Strikes Back has the best lightsaber duel. But why? What exactly makes it so great? Well, for one, it's far and away the most beautifully shot. And arguably, it has the most going on in terms of the characters involved.
I am your father.
But for me, what puts it in a league apart is that it is easily the most visually sophisticated, giving nuanced expression to Star Wars' conception of morality. In my first essay, I talked about how films primarily interested in entertaining their audience do so by affirming their cultural values, rather than questioning them. The simplest way to figure out what those values are, particularly those pertaining to morality, is to look at the heroes and ask, what makes them the good guys?
Too short for a stormtrooper?
Huh? Oh, the uniform.
In Star Wars, the heroes are the Jedi Knights, a monastic, militant order of the sort the world hasn't seen since medieval times, and they certainly look the part. Like Shaolin or Franciscan monks, they drape themselves in simple, distinctive robes that signal a life lived in ascetic rejection of worldly pleasures in exchange for spiritual fulfillment. Like the samurai and the Knights Templar, the Jedi wield a distinctive sword that is equal parts weapon and religious or cultural icon.
This weapon is your life.
An elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
And, like pretty much every religious group in the history of ever, they have a huge, ostentatious temple that contradicts the simplicity they preach. This romantic application of medieval iconography is key to understanding what Star Wars is all about. Unlike true science fiction, Star Wars doesn't look toward the future for answers to our deepest questions. It looks to the past, seeking an unchanging, universal truth as ancient as creation itself.
Life creates it. Makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
In attempting to recreate Joseph Campbell's theory of the hero cycle, the monomyth shared in almost every culture throughout history, George Lucas distilled every major religion down to their most fundamental elements. A metaphysical force that is both the source of all life and the energy that binds it.
It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
A force that has a will, ineffable but undeniable.
Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force.
An eternal struggle between light and dark.
Is the dark side stronger?
No. But the busier, more seductive.
And a prophecy foretelling its end.
You refer to the prophecy of the one who will bring balance to the Force.
But above all is the idea that everyone must choose a side. A spiritual path to the light or to the dark. Nothing in between.
Never. I'll never turn to the dark side.
Our Jedi heroes, having chosen the light, exemplify all the characteristics believers aspire to emulate. Serenity, wisdom, selflessness, courage, all achieved through that universal religious communion with the spiritual world we call meditation or prayer, what the Jedi enigmatically referred to as reaching out
with your feelings.
As they see it, the truth has always been carried within you. You just have to believe.
I don't believe it.
That is why you fail.
Well, actually, you have to do a little more than that, because once you've chosen a side, you've also chosen to fight. In a world with a moral binary, every conflict becomes a conflict of good and evil, light and dark. And the only way to solve the conflict is through the complete and total defeat of the other side. Now, Yoda tries to sugarcoat this a little.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
Which is understandable for a dude who was duped into waging a war that turned out to be a massive Sith conspiracy, and who witnessed its devastating consequences. But the reality is that lightsabers are an integral part of a Jedi's identity. They are knights, after all, and they aren't exactly known for leaving violence as a last resort. And before anyone says self-defense,
we don't put civilians at risk or even potentially at risk to save ourselves. Sometimes that means we lose the battle, and sometimes our lives. But if you can't make that choice, then you can't wear that uniform.
The willingness with which the Jedi engage in violence makes sense when you consider that they live in a world where diplomacy and negotiation are completely ineffective and ultimately pointless, only serving to forestall the inevitable.
This deal is getting worse all the time.
In fact, they're so useless that the Jedi joke about it.
You were right about one thing, Master. The negotiations were short.
And when I got to them, we went into aggressive negotiations. Thank you.
Aggressive negotiations? What's that?
Well, negotiations with a lightsaber.
Even Luke's attempt to talk his father back to the light inevitably descends into violence. These Star Wars between the two sides of the Force must be had. As Maz Kanata says to Han, you can't keep running from the oldest fight there is. For good to prevail, violence is a moral requisite. With all this in mind, we can now begin to see how Irvin Kershner used cinematic form to visually express this moral philosophy. Now, there are three things we need to pay attention to here: color, contrast, and elevation. The coloration of the sabers is obvious, red for the dark side and blue for the light. But notice as well that the entire arena is bathed in these two colors, with high contrast between light and shadow. This look arose from a need to transform a set that was flat and shallow into something worth pointing a camera at, but it became a perfect reflection of the fight itself. The visual opposition symbolized the moral clarity present at the beginning of the duel. In Luke's mind, he is good and Vader is evil, and Vader must be defeated. Enough said. As the fight progresses, the seesaw of combat advantage is visually rendered as a simple matter of who is up and who is down. The idea of the moral high ground pops up now and then throughout Star Wars, perhaps the most dubiously famous example being this one.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
But while here the language is simplistic to a fault, Obi-Wan's elevated position linking power and virtue as synonymous, Kershner deliberately complicates this relationship. We begin with the Black Knight in the highest position of power, despite the depths of his evil. Our champion of the light is thus forced to literally step up to the challenge. Luke then gets his ass kicked twice, each time falling below Vader. But just when Vader thinks he's captured Luke, he is surprised to discover that Luke has bested him and is above him. This section of the fight ends with Luke knocking Vader down, but while it ends with Luke in the up position, the fight is gradually sinking lower and lower. Elevation is therefore used to demonstrate who has the upper hand at any given moment, but also to show that Luke is being pulled deeper into a moral crisis by having him sink into the depths of Cloud City. The second stage of the fight takes place in an arena still defined by high contrast, but this time lacking in color. They battle on level ground here, but now that we've left the arena of pure moral certainty, confusion begins to set in. Vader's assault switches focus to disorienting Luke, and succeeds in knocking him further down. We've now fallen into a place without hue and without contrast. What tiny slivers of color remain disappear when the battle becomes one of words. Here, negotiation is once again affirmed as the wayward path for the true of spirit, as empty promises of galactic peace are being used to tempt Luke into the dark side.
With our combined strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy.
At the moment Vader reveals that he is Luke's father, the moral confusion Luke experiences, being unable to tell good apart from evil, is perfectly reflected in a mise-en-scène that is quite literally a gray area. And despite the fact that Luke is obviously staged lower than Vader, they are shot almost as if they are level with each other. In Star Wars, the loss of moral conviction is a terrible crisis. It causes Luke to plunge into despair, reaching his lowest point in the sequence, both physically and spiritually. For Anakin and Kylo Ren, the journey across the no man's land of a moral gray area causes them unbearable anguish and torment, such that turning to the dark side comes as a relief.
I will do whatever you ask.
For Anakin in particular, it is so agonizing that the first time around it nearly kills him, rendering him too physically weak to survive the second. For the luckier characters we see enter and languish in these muddy waters, Asajj Ventress falling from the dark side, and Ahsoka Tano losing faith in the light, they suffer a terrible loss of identity, and consequently, are out of the fight. At least, as long as the crisis lasts. Of course, how good and evil are actually defined is, as is often the case with religious doctrine, somewhat paradoxical. For instance, it is made abundantly clear that most natural human emotions are in some way a gateway to the dark side.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
And yet, reaching out with your feelings is the most fundamental technique for accessing the Force. Not to mention that the selfless do-goodery the Jedi aspire to is one that is inescapably founded on empathy.
I'll wager my new racing pod against, say, the boy and his mother.
Your pod is worth 2 slaves, not by a long shot.
The boy and them.
Not the cold, emotionless logic of the Vulcans.
Were I to invoke logic, logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one.
The prequels, deeply flawed as they are, nonetheless touched upon this dogmatic paradox in a fascinating way.
Are you allowed to love? Thought that was forbidden for a Jedi.
Attachment is forbidden. Possession is forbidden. Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love, is central to a Jedi's life. So you might say that we are encouraged to love.
But again, in keeping with its religious qualities, Star Wars emphasizes the importance of belief over knowledge. Knowing the specific boundaries between light and dark is not as important as choosing a side to believe in. Because if you believe, then light and dark become matters of instinct.
But how am I to know the good side from the bad?
You will know when you are calm, at peace, passive.
Belief is how you know killing one person is good, but killing another is bad, unburdened by a philosophical doubt that asks why.
But tell me why I can't...
No, there is no why. Nothing more will I teach you today. Clear your mind of questions.
But while Star Wars views doubt as a test of faith, a crucible that must be endured, Say, like a perilous bridge that must be crossed on your moral journey. Star Trek sees it as the very foundation of enlightenment, something that should be embraced as an ever-present guide in a whole universe of gray areas. But that is a topic for Part 2. Now, I know you're going to be asking, when's Part 2 going to come out? And the honest answer is, I don't know. But rest assured, there will be a Part 2 eventually.